The treatment of the dead at Little Bighorn, where General Custer made his final stand against the combined forces of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, illustrates a great deal about the views of the time toward life, death, and the respect shown to those who lay on the battlefield. The terrible tale of the most notorious conflict of the numerous American Indian Wars is told by the dead left to the elements and subject to both natural and human forces. Montana, Bighorn County, 1876. Even after 2 centuries of growth, colonization, and battle, there is still hostility between the new Americans and the Aboriginal tribes. Particularly, the Plains Indians posed a significant obstacle to American advance. A significant obstacle to American growth was the Plains Indians in particular. The tribes that made up the Plains Indians, including the Apache, Comanche, Cheyenne, and others, were well known for their prowess as fighters and particularly dreaded for their unparalleled horsemanship. Despite typically operating as relatively tiny war bands with bows, tomahawks, and a few other weapons, they were nonetheless able to cause significant damage to both professional, well-trained American soldiers and the inexperienced settlers who had moved on their territory. These tribes constituted a significant danger to American authority in the regions where they roamed because they were ferocious, uncompromising, and constantly prepared to fight. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed in 1851. Between 118 and 544, preventing intertribal conflicts and protecting American interests in white settlers was its main objective since, in addition to endangering white settlers, intertribal conflicts also hindered trade and led to unwanted and expensive intervention by American government and military forces. In order to prevent any attempts at territorial expansion, the contract explicitly defined the boundaries of 8 Aboriginal tribes and specified their lands. Along with allowing for the construction of roads and fortifications and guaranteeing the safe use of the Oregon Trail by travelers, the area was recognized as autonomous tribe territory that the United States had not yet claimed. Conflict reappeared a few years later. Former rivals had remained rivals, and when enormous quantities of gold were found on Indian territories, their trespassing on each other's territory in pursuit of buffalo made matters worse. Those looking to make their fortune moved to the region and started settling there in contravention of the treaty, and American officials did little to stop these violations of the recently signed agreement. All parties' dissatisfaction was only increased by this, and the United States was finally compelled to take action in 1866. The Red Cloud's War began and lasted for 2 years, during which time 200 American soldiers and civilians, as well as an undetermined number of Indians, were murdered. The war ended with the signing of the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, which followed 2 years of fighting. Similar to the first treaty, however, it was virtually immediately violated once more by the invading white gold miners, who were not permitted to enter the reservation by law. Although there were some attempts by the Army to stop this, they were mostly unsuccessful due to the high number of settlers. Unfulfilled promises. The U.S. government, unable to control the influx of immigrants hoping to take advantage of the region's gold riches and lumber, started to put pressure on the Lakota to cede their rights to the Black Hills, a region rich in resources. One colonel went so far as to say that it was the only part they valued. For years, resentment developed. The Lakota were under constant pressure from the Americans to cede their territory. They attacked the locals viciously because they wanted to build the Northern Pacific Railroad across some of the few remaining fertile buffalo hunting sites. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, 2 prominent Lakota native war leaders, advocated for armed resistance. Many Sioux and Cheyenne tribes, who had previously been unwilling to battle, joined the 2 men after realizing they would only receive unfulfilled promises from the Americans. By the early hours of the 25th, Custer and his men had discovered a native camp about 14 miles east of the Little Bighorn River after being dispatched as scouts from the main expeditionary force on June 22, 1876. Prior to learning that an enemy warband had found their path, Custer's scouts had prepared a surprise attack for the following day. The choice was taken to strike right away before the opposing army could close the distance. At Little Bighorn, Custer divided his 700 men into 3 divisions. One charged the hamlet directly, one stopped the indigenous from fleeing from the south, and the final one, led by Custer, would launch an attack from the north. Around noon, Custer and his soldiers entered the Little Bighorn Valley on horseback and launched the assault. Crazy Horse confronted Custer directly, while Chief Sitting Bull and his men ensured the women and children were secure. According to American intelligence, the campsite contained no more than 800 fighters. There were actually 2,000 fighters, many of whom have superior equipment to the Americans. Custer and his 210 men were immediately surrounded and cut off from their allies because to the quick repeating rifles they were using, as opposed to the Americans' single-shot Springfields. Custer and his men were completely destroyed after the battle, which lasted barely more than an hour, ended with the defense of what is now known as Last Stand Hill. The specifics of the conflict are unknown because no man lived to recount the actual events of Custer's last stand. Native stories of the war that were later transmitted orally down the centuries are sometimes contradictory and untrustworthy. A few days later, Custer, a native Crow scout named Ashishisha, provided a hazy account of the conflict, claiming that Custer had attacked the village directly but had been swiftly forced back to Last Stand Hill, where he and his soldiers subsequently perished. It wasn't until 2 days later that the two other squads dispatched to attack the settlement found out that Custer had been defeated. After hearing the shocking news, they hurried to locate them. With the majority of their dead already gone, the native warriors had already left. Only the 210 American casualties were still on the battlefield. Despite their best efforts, the guys were unable to piece together the events that transpired at the battlefield. Between 5:44 and 6:32, the third group's leader, Captain Frederick Benteen, concluded from the scene that it was a panic and a rout until the final man was slain. I firmly believe that the men probably let their horses run loose without being told to do so. Despite the fact that several commands were provided, few people followed them. They were probably in a panic. As previously said, it was a rout. The American remains had been brutally disfigured and had been stripped of much of their clothing, as well as any practical belongings like knives and firearms. To prevent them from fighting in the hereafter, the soldiers had their trigger fingers amputated because they believed that one takes their body with them. In order to prevent Custer from reproducing, an arrow was put into his genitalia, and knitting needles were pushed into his ears because he would not listen. The deceased were hurriedly interred in shallow graves while the campaign was still in progress. 6:32 to 7:09. Many of the dead soldiers' graves were merely a few shovelfuls of soil piled on top of one another because the men had so few digging equipment between them. Custer's burial, marked with stakes driven into the dirt and 18 inches deep, was the most distinguished. A piece of paper bearing his name was packed up into a case of spent cartridges and inserted into the stake. Custer had apparently been shot in the heart, which was the cause of death. His head had been shot, but since it had not bled, it was most likely done after he passed away. The last resting spot. The people made numerous requests during the course of the following year to go back to the battlefield, retrieve the dead, and bury them in a dignified manner. 7:09 to 7:48. The wives and friends of the officers who were killed with Custer are pressing me to bring in their bodies, and I wrote to ask if the Secretary of War will authorize the necessary expense. Lieutenant General Sheridan wrote to General Sherman. There might be enough incidental money in the Adjutant General's office or other money under the Secretary's control that could be utilized for this. The amount needed will be minimal. Sheridan and Sherman persisted in pressing the military authorities after their request was denied, and they eventually got approval. On July 2nd, soldiers arrived at the battlefield, set up camp, and started their grueling mission. The men discovered the place covered in decomposing carcasses that had been consumed by predators and wild animals. 7:48 to 8:46. Sticks were initially used to mark the deceased's last resting places until they were positive that everyone had been found. After the officers were recognized, their remains were gathered and placed in coffins that were ready to be reinterred at an army fort nearby. However, the enlisted guys would never go from their last resting locations. Because there were too many of them to evacuate, their corpses were left in situ. After being marked with stakes, they were interred in more appropriate graves. Confident his work had been done, and all men had been buried honorably, Sheridan and his men left the area. However, the Montana wet season was quickly approaching, and the loose, dusty earth was quickly swept away by rainstorms, exposing the bones to the elements and predators once more. Shortly after the rain started, John Fauch took a picture that revealed the area covered with bones once more. A momentary triumph. While the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes had a short but spectacular victory, they did not actually win the conflict. 847 to 915. With Custer and his troops eternally etched in American history as valiant, honorable warriors, the American people and government united behind them. A massive, overwhelming army of American soldiers was brought in to crush their enemies and put an end to any further revolt, because Custer had been a great hero of the Civil War, and the nation wanted to get revenge for his murder. After American forces took over Native American lands and hunting areas, the majority of the Native warriors gave up within a year because they were unwilling to battle on. 915 to 932. The United States took the Black Hills without paying any compensation, despite the fact that hundreds of men had died for them. The region was overrun with gold miners and produced enormous wealth. Wagon loads of gold valued at $300,000 or more were frequently transported by treasure coaches.